Welcome, fellow ecologists. Chapter 9 deals with population distribution and abundance. And in this chapter, I'll be talking about how animals are distributed across their environment and what limits that distribution, and what sorts of patterns we see in the distribution of animals in their populations, and then also how the size of animals tends to affect their population density. And then finally, I'll be talking about some of the factors that affect how common or rare various organisms are. We need to start out this section by making sure that we know what an animal population is. And what we're talking about really is a group of organisms that belong to a particular species that we find in a particular area. That area might be defined by the researcher, or it may be defined by natural boundaries we encounter, like maybe along a river or somebody's backyard we could use to define the boundaries of a population. When we think of populations and trying to study them, we look at how many individuals there are for a particular area, the density in the population. Sometimes we consider how old the various individuals are and what their growth rates might be, and certainly the distribution of the population across a particular area and how abundant they are. All of these factors are important to ecologists and resource managers. Even though we find organisms all over the world in just about every environment, when you think about a particular population, you begin to realize that there are physical restrictions on where that population might occur, and those restrictions involve the amount of water that's available and the temperatures that occur at different times of the year. And so we're all familiar with these different distribution of organisms based on environmental conditions. One of the terms that's often associated with the distribution of animals that are in a particular population in an area is the niche. And the niche can be defined by the physical characteristics of an area, or it can also be defined by some of the biotic limiting factors that an organism might encounter. Most ecologists equate the term niche with the ecological researcher by the name of Hutchinson. And he's the one that developed the idea of this n-dimensional hypervolume as a description of a niche. And you could think of it as a ball with just an unlimited number of little sides or facets to it. And in this description, what he was trying to get at was the idea that there are many, many aspects of a niche, and they can be behavioral or the impact of other organisms that live in the area or environmental conditions. But basically the niche describes the area that an organism lives in and the role that it has in that ecosystem, the role or its job in that ecosystem. Within the term niche, we have some subdivisions of that: fundamental niche and realized niche. And the fundamental niche is the area that an organism could potentially live in based on its physiological capabilities, whereas the realized niche is the area that it actually lives in after you take into account competition with other species. An interesting study of the distribution of animals was done by Cowley in Australia, the distribution of different types of large kangaroos. And he and his colleagues found that the eastern grey kangaroo mainly lived in an area of Australia where there was the most of the rain would fall in the summertime. And then they found that the western gray kangaroo occurred mainly in the southern part of Australia, where the majority of the rainfall occurred during the winter time. And then the red kangaroo was distributed more in the central part of the country, where the conditions were kind of hot and dry. So the physiological characteristics of these different species allowed them to survive more effectively in different environmental conditions. And so their niches were somewhat different, and they divided up the continent based on that. The distribution of animals like the kangaroo may not be directly determined by climate, but it might be an indirect kind of effect based on the type of plants that are able to grow in the area and therefore produce a certain type of food that the animal really likes. Or perhaps the water supply is really the thing that's driving it, or the type of terrain that occurs in a particular area. Some animals would prefer a mountainous type habitat as compared to a plain. Or maybe it's even the parasites that live in a particular area. In Africa, there was a valley that the tsetse fly lived in that prevented livestock from being raised in those areas. And once they got rid of the tsetse fly, then that range was more available for the livestock. The distribution of the tiger beetle gives us a good example of a physiological characteristic that allows this beetle to live at cooler temperatures and therefore up in the mountainous type environment where other beetles aren't able to do as well, and so it gets a competitive advantage by being able to live in this particular habitat. And it shows how the physical environment limits the species distribution, but we also see how the enhanced metabolic rate of this particular species gives it an advantage in being able to live in an area where other beetles aren't able to survive. The distribution of Encelium species provides a good example of how plants can be affected by environmental conditions. These plants were distributed differently along the southern part of California based on the amount of annual rainfall and also the temperatures in the different areas. And even the species that did overlap in their distribution, when they looked at the microclimate of each of these, they found that the Encelium frutescens was mainly found in the stream channel areas, where the Encelium farinosa was mainly on the upland slopes. So they were kind of distributed differently in a small geographic range, whereas they were in the same large geographic range. The classical study that most ecologists talk about with regard to distribution of animals is the study of barnacles in the intertidal zone. The intertidal zone is that area where the tide moves up the shore, and the different parts of the shore are wet for a different amount of time during the day, and the upper portions are quite dry, and the middle portions get splashed quite a bit, so they're moist a good part of the day, and then the lower portions are underwater almost all the time. And here, what researchers found was that the genus Thamylus was mainly found in the upper portions of the intertidal zone, while as the genus Balanus was mainly limited to the middle and lower portions of the intertidal zone. After a variety of experiments with these barnacles, what researchers found was that at the larval stage, the larvae settle out in all different parts of the intertidal zone for both species. But the Balanus genus was unable to withstand the desiccation that occurred in the upper part of that intertidal zone. It just couldn't withstand the drying out. They kind of close up when the water isn't there, and it appears that Thamellus has the ability to close up more effectively and stay moist on the inside while the water isn't coming over them. The Balanus, on the other hand, seemed to be able to outcompete the larvae of Thamellus in the deeper section or the lower section of the intertidal zone. And so competition was preventing Thamellus from surviving in that area, and desiccation was preventing Balanus for surviving in the upper areas. The distribution of plants and animals can be categorized in terms of small-scale distributions into three main categories: random, regular, and clumped. Random distribution is just basically says that they could occur just about anywhere in a particular area. There isn't any competition or attraction or anything that's going on in order to determine their distribution. The regular distribution, on the other hand, is usually associated with some sort of competition or fighting between groups that causes them to separate from each other, and they get this regular distribution. And then the clumped distribution usually indicates that there's some type of benefit for being together in a group, where the individuals may be helping each other or protecting each other from predators in some way. You think of herds of animals kind of clumped together, or schools of fish, in order to prevent predation. Stingless bees in the tropical regions provided a great example of the different types of distributions that can be found in the associated behaviors that determine those distributions. Here, the stingless bees that were aggressive would fight over nesting sites and kind of force each other to stay a certain distance apart. So they ended up with a regular distribution, whereas the non-aggressive stingless bees were randomly distributed throughout the area because they didn't have these big battles amongst each other, and so they would just select a site that worked out well for them, and that's where they would build their nest. Another landmark study that ecologists have used as an example of distributions is the distribution of desert shrubs, particularly the creosote bush in the Sonoran Desert. This is an area that I've visited a number of times, and it's really fascinating to see how the plants are so evenly distributed in this area. The creosote bush, when it first starts out as a young bush, it's distributed in a clumped manner because of the way that the seeds were distributed, or perhaps just growing up near the adult plant. But then as they grow bigger, there's sort of a sorting mechanism where some of the individuals die out that are in the clump, and they end up with a random distribution. But later on, they get into a more extensive competition with each other based on their root systems and the fact that there's a limited amount of water. And so they end up with a regular distribution based on the competition between individuals. When we consider distributions of organisms across a large scale, typically those distributions are clumped. One of the examples of this came about thanks to the work of lots of volunteers across the country in doing the Christmas bird count and the breeding bird survey. Birders are a very active group of volunteers around the country that get very excited about identifying birds, and they like to participate in these bird counts even during the cold wintertime around Christmas. And in analyzing these distribution patterns based on the data that was submitted by these volunteers, they found that birds tend to be clumped in particular patterns depending on the particular types of trees or environment in a particular area, maybe the amount of water in that area. But there was definitely a clumped distribution. In looking at large-scale distribution of plants, particularly woody plants or trees, we can see that there's also a clump distribution of various species, and researchers here found that that occurred along a moisture gradient. And what they mean by a moisture gradient is the change in the amount of water in the soil as you move from, say, a riverbed up the slope and further away or up the mountain. There's less and less water available for the trees, and various species tended to clump along that gradient. In our area, we see willows being clumped right along riverbanks. Then as you move further away, you have things like maples and beech. In one of the studies that they described in the book, they talked about how the mountain pine was mainly found in the upper slope, which was drier, and then the red maples were found mainly on the mid slope, which had an intermediate amount of water in the soil. And then the hemlocks were found down in the moist valley bottom, where they were able to get a lot more water. When we consider population density with relation to organism size, that's the number of individuals per a given area, what they found in studying this was exactly what you would expect, and that is that the organisms with the larger body size had a lower population density. So there are no surprises here, but it's good to document this type of thing. In terms of being able to manage things like deer herds, or being able to understand the distribution of things like macroinvertebrates, as you see in this diagram, in a stream environment, all of this is beneficial to the overall resource management. When you consider plant population densities, trees are a good example. You think of walking into a forest right at the edge there where there are lots of small trees. You see they're very close together, but as you walk further into the forest, you see that the larger trees that have outcompeted the other trees are spaced further apart, so you get a lower density of the large mature trees. The last section of the chapter deals with commonness and rarity of individuals or populations, and figure 9.22 in your book is a really good one to put this into perspective. It gives you a gradient from most common to rarest, and in the most common category it has the three characteristics that would result in a particular species being very, very common, and that's extensive geographical range, so it can occur in a lot of different areas, a broad habitat tolerance, so physiologically it's able to withstand great variations in temperature or the amount of water or the type of geography, and then the large local population so that it could withstand a situation where a big storm comes along and a large number of them are killed. There'd still be enough left to keep the population going. Then in this diagram, the those sections that are in white indicate areas where populations become more and more vulnerable to extinction, things like restricted geographic range, narrow habitat tolerance, and small local population. And the more of these that are found in a population, the rarer they are. So your book has divided up rarity into three categories. Rarity 1 is the extensive range, broad habitat tolerance, and small local populations. And then Rarity 2, extensive range, large populations, but narrow habitat tolerance. And then Rarity 3 is the extreme rarity, which is a restricted range, narrow habitat tolerance, and small populations like the mountain gorilla.